Hello. Welcome once again to Off the Shelf Books on Tour. We have a most interesting author with us today, Mr. Christopher Klein, who manufactured, wrote, invested how much of your life in a book when the Irish invaded Canada. Who knew?
Yeah,
Knocked
exactly.
my socks off.
Yeah, great.
Really?
Glad to hear it.
What was your impetus for writing it? Did you get shocked one day?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So the last book I wrote was a biography of John L. Sullivan, who was an Irish-American boxer from the 1880s, 1890s.
I visited his grave at Arlington.
Oh, great, great. So when I was researching the book, there's a mention of one of his opponents being a veteran of the attack on Canada. I did double take. I'm like,
That was my
what is this?
reaction.
So, I did research into it, and I found out that not only was there an attack by an Irish-American army on Canada once, but it happened 5 times between 1866
They
and
were
1871.
diligent, if nothing else.
They kept on trying, and I think it goes to speak to a lot of just their experiences living under British rule and their love of their homeland, even after being in America for so long.
Mm-hmm. But the one that tickled me, not even tickled me, the first soldier to die in the American Civil War was an Irishman.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a scholar named Damien Shields who has done research on this, and he's found that there was 200,000 native Irish who fought in the Civil War for the Union cause and another 20,000 for the Confederacy. So it's just amazing how many Irish-born soldiers there were who were fighting in the Civil War, and they spilled the first blood at Fort Sumter.
Yeah, but why?
Well, it wasn't a combat.
No, but it's almost a predecessor to the Comedy of Errors that continued.
So the surrender ceremony at Fort Sumter, the night after the attack, cannon misfires as they're lowering the flag and kills one of the native Irish soldiers in the fort.
And that's supposedly called friendly fire, and I could never understand that.
Yeah.
That makes no sense to me. But why? You know, maybe the first 25, 50 pages, why did they want to go and pick a fight with Canada?
Okay, so the first thing to know about this time period is that Canada is a province of Great Britain. So it's the flag that's flying over, it's the Union Jack, it's not the maple leaf that we know it to be today. And if we were going to talk about the Irish who invaded Canada in today's parlance, we'd say that they were radicalized by their experience living under the British, which had colonized Ireland for 700 years. And then in the 1840s and 1850s, the potato crop fails. And to the most militant of Irish, they think that the British are not doing enough to assist them. They think that there might be an attempt by the British to exterminate them altogether. And 1 million Irish died, 2 million are forced to flee to this country. And they never forget this trauma. It remains raw, 20 years afterwards. And they still want to liberate their homeland. And the thought among a group of these Irish is, rather than trying to launch another revolution in Ireland that has failed repeatedly over the centuries, why don't we go to the British Empire at its nearest point to the United States, which is right over the border in Canada. So if you're from Massachusetts, you could jump right on a train, be there overnight. Next morning, you could march right off to battle and cross into British territory.
And as I remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, we had just made the Louisiana Purchase, which acquiesced a tremendous amount of land to the south, and that they really believed in Alaska. And they really believed if they could conquer Canada, the United States would be all one.
So there's really this idea of manifest destiny is still in the American bloodstream at that point. So you do have the country that has now gone from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It's encompassed territory from Mexico after the Mexican-American War. And the thought is, well, the most logical place for the country to expand next is up in Canada. And there's actually bills that are introduced in Congress that apportions out where the 4 new states are going to be and 29 congressmen. And there's a senator from Michigan at the end of the Civil War who gets a plan with the backing of 30 other senators that the way to heal the United States after the Civil War was to put together a 200,000 man army, half the men from the North, half the men from the South, and they would go up to Canada and seize
Jackson
it.
and Johnson funded it and were a part of it and were aware of it and
Yeah.
encouraged it.
Yep. So there's a lot of animosity towards Great Britain at the end of the Civil War because Great Britain had declared itself neutral, which to American eyes, they might as well have been backing the Confederacy. They saw it as a tacit backing of the Confederacy. And warships that were used by the Confederacy were built in British ports and manned by British sailors. So at the end of the war, President Andrew Johnson wants the British to pay reparations for all the damage that was caused by them. So the Fenians come along at the right time because this is a way for Johnson to leverage the British to pay those claims that he wants paid after the Civil War.
And being in New England, quite a few Irish are here, and quite a few of their ancestors came from Ireland and couldn't get into the States, so they settled in Nova Scotia, Montreal, Quebec, and Prince Edward Island. So as these guys are making their way up, these guys are arming themselves because they want to be free of British rule in Canada.
Well, that is sort of the assumption that the Irish in America are making, is that the Irish in Canada are going to rise up and assist them. And not only did they think that, they thought that all the French speakers in Quebec would do the same, that they would want to cast off British rule again. And I think we see this a lot in military history. There's these overinflated assumptions that the people that we go into, you know, the United States will be greeted as liberators, or any army is going to be greeted as liberators and get the backing of the population. And a lot of times it's a false assumption, and this will end up being the case for the Irish who invade Canada as well. They don't really get too much backing from the French speakers in Quebec or the Irish in Canada.
But there's always that middle line of people who will befriend both sides,
right,
to see who comes out on top, so they better themselves for it.
Right. So, I mean, they didn't get too far inside Canada to really test that to see what would have happened at that tipping point if they had made it to the big cities
And they
in
get
Canada.
wiped out almost everything. Well, they won one war,
well,
one skirmish.
They have an invasion in June of 1866 that is a victory at what's called the Battle of Ridgeway, and it's the first victory by an Irish army over forces of the British Empire since 1745. And then they do win another battle in Fort Erie later that afternoon. That is most definitely going to be the high point of these 5 invasions. As they continue to pile up, they get more and more farcical in nature.
They don't learn from their own history very well.
No, they don't. And they didn't learn from American history very well either, because they were trying very much the same plan that was tried by the Continental Army in 1775 when it went to Canada during the War of 1812. They pretty much trotted out a very similar battle plan to what was tried in the War of 1812
That's the only one I can remember ever studying was the War of 1812. And I don't remember that the Irish were predominantly mentioned.
Yeah, and they didn't play a big role in that. But when the plan is being put together, and this is not in spite of their lack of success on the battlefields, it was not a whiskey-fueled, fly-by-night operation. They had a Union Army general by the name of Thomas William Sweeney, who put together this plan, this 5-pronged invasion plan of Canada. And he's a student of military history, and he is looking back on this plan, the War of 1812, which was going to be this amphibious invasion at various points across the border with boats being launched from Chicago and Cleveland, and crossings from Detroit and Buffalo, and then a main army going right up through the Lake Champlain Valley in Vermont to seize Montreal and Quebec City, which is a plan that had been tried a couple times before.
They were diligent.
Yeah.
And as I remember it, one time they got there 1,000 strong with no ammunition or guns.
So in June 1866, their real big invasion, they managed to have guns and ammunition that they crossed over with, but that was it. They didn't have any commissary, they didn't have any horses, they didn't have any supplies, and they pretty much figured they would live off the land and seize it when they got there. And they were able to do it for about 48 hours successfully. Another time around, they tried an invasion from Vermont as well, and had even fewer supplies there, and that fizzled out quickly as
And the
well.
people on the border towns, both Canadian and American, they were tired of them because they were knocking at their door asking for food and money and lodging, and nobody would give them the funds to get back to their own homes. And wasn't it the president finally decided?
So what happens is that many of the men, they're paying with their own money to go, for the train fare, and some of them are traveling as far as New Orleans to get up to Canada to join in this fight. And afterwards, they come back to American territory, and they have no way of getting home. So you have, after this invasion in June 1866, you have thousands of Irishmen who are just loitering around Buffalo, New York, because they have no way of getting home. So eventually, the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, will decide that he will pay for everyone's transit to go home. And that's how they end up leaving. The problem will occur again 4 years later after another invasion. And this time, American government's like, no, we paid for these people once, we're not going to do it again. And they're loitering around upstate New York until finally the governor of New York pays for some of their fares, and the other person who pays for their fare is the infamous Boss Tweed of Tammany Hall fame in New York. So they end up funding their transit for these men to get back to their homes after these failed invasions.
But they had a tremendous amount of financial support to get there, to fund it. So it wasn't just the people who marched or fought. There were a lot of people in America who funded their efforts.
Yeah, so they
almost like the guys in the middle of the line to see who came out the better.
So they actually sold, the equivalent of war bonds. So in denominations of from $10 to $500, you could pay for the cause of Ireland. You'd pay your money, and then these bonds would be redeemable 6 months after the establishment of the Irish Republic and being paid with interest. And a funny side note to that is that when the Irish Republic was finally established decades later, all of a sudden these bonds start coming out of the drawers that people had them squirreled away in America looking to get them paid in Dublin, and the Irish government had no knowledge of what these bonds were all about and did not pay for them. But this was the organization behind it, called the Fenian Brotherhood, had a huge membership in the months after the Civil War. The Fenian Brotherhood would go in during the Civil War. They would send recruiters into Union Army camps, and they would gain members that way, and members would pay their dues, and that's how they raised money. And then after the war, they started sending recruiters to the mill cities in Massachusetts, to the mining towns in Pennsylvania, and they would put on concerts with Irish music or grand picnics.
Get
and
them all revved
money.
up.
They would raise money that way. Yeah, get them fired up, and then have them sign up to become members of the Fenian Brotherhood, hand over their money. And by 1866, there's tens of thousands of members of the Fenian Brotherhood. And what's really astonishing is they're operating right out in the open. They elect their own president, they have their own constitution, they have their own Capitol building, which is called the Fenian White House, right on the north side of Union Square in this 4-story brownstone, where inside the president and the Secretary of War are in there developing
lavish luxury.
They had one of the most fine brownstones in New York City, and so they're flying the Irish flag and the stars and stripes from the top of it. So this is not some fly-by-night operation. They are well established as Republican
coming
exile.
this close to being the Irish mafia? If you were in New York and you besmirched the Irish, somebody would beat you up if an Irishman was there.
Well,
or they heard you besmirch them. There were people that got beaten up and left on the sidewalk bleeding.
it's a very violent time in the decades after the Irish arrive in the United States. So if you ever read about the Five Points neighborhood in New York, it was you had these roving gangs, often divided by ethnicities or even by religion too. So I mean, you have this division inside the Irish also between the Protestant Irish and the Catholic Irish, and it's a very fierce time.
Yes, to this day, still. When they came back to New York and and how many times did they lose everything only to build it back up again?
Yeah, well, they tried this 5 times.
And not unlike a group here, they started to fall apart from within.
Yeah.
They were accusing one another of embezzlement and skullduggery, and yet, before the ashes were cool, they built it up again.
Yeah, so I mean, you have these divisions inside the organization, because when the Fenian Brotherhood was founded, the original plan is that in the United States, the Irish in America will raise money, they'll purchase weapons, and then they'll ship them to Ireland, and where a sister organization is going to put together an army to launch another revolution. And the British find out about it, they crack down on this plan, and it doesn't look like it's going forward, and it then leads to this split inside the organization about whether to stay with the original plan or go with this new idea of attacking Canada. And then these two groups are constantly at loggerheads, as you mentioned, accusing each other of financial improprieties, and then you sort of get this competition between the two for the headlines and getting the money from the Irish out there that they have to do something newsworthy. So, launching an attack on Canada was a fundraising motive as much as it was a military motive for some of these invasions later on.
How long did it take you to write it? And is your library full of research?
So it took me close to 2 years to do the research and writing, and certainly got my share of a lot of great books in there. What's fantastic as a writer today is that working with materials from the 1860s, so many of these sources are digitized now. And I can, just from my home, be able to access all these. I can go online, I can read the letters from the Fenian leaders, I can look at the different missives that they were sending out, the government reports that they had in the aftermath of these, not to mention just all the newspapers of the day about it. So it's
So you didn't go to Ireland or Canada for research?
So I didn't go to Ireland for research. I did spend some time in Canada and went into the archives, the Canadian War Museum, and in the National Archives in Ottawa. Did some of the one of the most fun experiences I had was actually the farm. There's a farm in Vermont where 2 of these invasions were launched. This poor man named Alva Richard had nothing to do with it, but twice looked out his front window and saw the Irish marching right by his
so
doorstep.
That's 1 foot close to the Canadian border?
He was right on the border, but the farm is still in the family's name, and they have artifacts that were left behind when these Irish were basically running for their lives after getting routed at the battle. They still have the weapons, ammunition packs, all this stuff that was left behind on this farm 160 years ago still in their possession. So It was amazing to actually see those firsthand.
Now, having grown up in the North, I know my history book doesn't match the history book in the South. When you went to Canada, did you find what they kept, what they have on display, leans more to Canadians or the Irish that tried to take them over?
Well, I think it's everything I've seen rang very true
Good.
to me. And I think it is an event that is much more well known on the Canadian side than it is in America.
I
So
guess
at least
so.
they have some semblance of
People,
what
I
it is.
can't tell you how many people this week have asked me what I was reading, and I told them I was done, and they went, what?
Yeah,
But if you think of it and you process it, it makes sense.
yeah. So it's well known in Canada because it has
Day
this,
one.
Yeah, and this is sort of a formative moment in the formation of Canada as we know it today as a self-governing country, because in the wake of these attacks, Canadians lost faith in their British ability to protect them from these southern invaders. So they this really gives a push to the formation of Canada as a country, and the Parliament and the capital being in Ottawa. So a lot of it rings true. I do come across every now and then this idea among Canadians, even some who've done research into it, that this was just a bunch of drunken Irishmen out on a bender, and sort of minimizing what the scale of what this invasion was, and I don't think necessarily understanding the trauma and the pain that the Irish had gone through that led them to take what seems to be this this radical step.
I mean, their lives were on hold. They left their families. They weren't getting paid. And yeah, the loyalty to this day is very, very deep.
And you would see in the writings that they would have to each other, even men who still served in, they served in the Mexican-American War, they served in the Civil War, they fought for the Union, but when they're writing letters to each other, they would refer to anyone born in Ireland as Irish and anyone born in the United States as American, and they still were viewing citizenship in those terms, and it's just amazing to me that in some respects these Irish in America had more of a revolutionary bent in them than the Irish who remained back in Ireland, who are just trying to survive day to day, where the Irish here, they keep thinking about their exile from their homeland. They had to endure this much of the same discrimination among the Protestant aristocracy in America as they had back home. So in some respects, they were more filled with more revolutionary zeal than those back
Well,
then.
the same is true of St. Patrick's Day.
Oh yeah.
They do not celebrate St. Patrick's Day in Ireland to the extent that we
Correct. Yeah.
And I just recently heard Cinco de Mayo, which wasn't recently and celebrated big. They don't celebrate that in Mexico, not to the extent that we do here.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right about St. Patrick's Day. It's a holy day in Ireland, and until recently the pubs were all closed on that day. Also, this wasn't a street party.
That makes it really holy.
Yeah. So over here is a completely different story, but it absolutely speaks to this different identity that the Irish Americans are starting to have. When they come to America, they had always been insular people. That's how they were able to survive 7 centuries of English rule, and they react in much the same way when they come here, and they sort of really lean into that Irish identity.
Well, you don't miss what you had until it's taken away.
Yeah.
And now we get to pause, and you're going to read us so that our viewers can get an idea of your style, because the research and the eloquence is definitely there, fella. You did one heck of a job.
Thank you.
Be right back.
"13 months after Robert E. Lee laid down his sword at Appomattox Courthouse, former Confederate rebels slipped on their gray wool jackets. Union veterans longing to emancipate an oppressed people donned their blue capes. Battle-hardened warriors from both the North and the South returned to their front lines, but not to reignite the Civil War. Instead, the former foes became improbable brothers in arms, united against a common enemy, Great Britain. Entwined by Irish bloodlines, the private army that congregated on the south side of Buffalo, New York on the night of May 31st, 1866, shared not just a craving for gunpowder, but a yearning to liberate their homeland from the shackles of the British Empire. For 700 years, British rulers attempted to extinguish Ireland's religion, culture, and language, and when the potato crop failed in the 1840s and 1850s, causing 1 million people to die, some Irish believed that the British were trying to exterminate them as well. Many of the 2 million refugees fleeing the Great Hunger washed ashore in the United States, where the newcomers continued to face the scorn of nativist know-nothings, who believed the Irish had no intention of assimilating into American culture, but plotted to take handout after handout while imposing papal law on their adopted home. Even from a distance of nearly 15 years and 3,000 miles, the trauma remained raw for many of the insurgents who enlisted in the self-proclaimed Irish Republican Army. Radicalized by their collective ordeal, these Irish-American Civil War veterans viewed their service in the bloody crucibles of Bull Run, Antietam, and Gettysburg as training for the real fight they wanted to wage, one to free Ireland. Wearing green ribbons tied to their hats and fastened to their buttonholes, 800 Irish paramilitaries who had traveled from as far away as New Orleans emerged from the boarding houses and saloons of Buffalo's Irish enclave, the First Ward, on a clear spring night. Carrying green flags sewn by their wives, girlfriends, and mothers, and hauling 9 wagons laden with secretly stockpiled rifles and ammunition, the Irish Republican Army set off on one of the most fantastical missions in military history to kidnap Canada.
And the fact that so many know nothing about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica.
I find it an addition to my education, my heritage, and my knowledge of things that go on in the world that when people tell you only what they want you to know.
Thank you.
Thank you for wanting me to know this. Come again when you
Thank you,
write
Veronica.
another one?
Absolutely.
You going to do another Irish book?
Maybe. We'll see. We'll see. I got an idea there.
I would imagine the fodder is unbelievable. It's like a treasure trove.
Oh, yeah. There's plenty of stories wherever the Irish are involved.
Yes. And that's said with love. When the Irish Invaded Canada, Christopher Klein is the excellent author who brought it to us. A very good read. Bye now.